41-year-old New York-based freelance photographer Linda Lanson was a mother to a girl who was 7 years old. She had relocated to Tampa, Florida to live with her niece Linda Sheffield after leaving New York. Linda Lanson was a really kind woman. She taught Sheffield several fundamental skills that she was unaware of, including how to count, how to do her makeup, and a variety of other things. Nobody knew things were to change forever when Lanson left her residence on the evening of July 10, 1983. She would never return. Her body was discovered on July 11, 1983 by a jogger. The body was reported to the Tampa Police Department by him. When police arrived, they discovered the victim in the bushes of a dead-end road, only half-dressed with a gunshot wound to the head. After starting their investigation, the police located her abandoned car the following day on a quiet street about 10 miles from where she was discovered. Shortly after, her purse was discovered in Clearwater, Florida, a city located about 20 miles outside of Tampa by the side of a road. Although the police kept working on this case, they were unable to find any leads until another case very much like it was reported to them a month later. Barbara Grams, then 19 years old, was on her way home from her job at the mall in August 1983 when she never arrived. The neighborhood residents found her body on August 19, 1983. She'd been abandoned in a Tampa Heights neighborhood behind a dentist's office. Robert Dubois was the initial suspect in the Barbara case. He was 18 years old at the time of the murder, and a local who saw him causing trouble in the community reported him to the police. Robert was questioned by the police, and he agreed to them taking a dental impression to match a bite mark that had been discovered on Barbara's cheek. Dr. Richard Souverin, a forensic odontologist, concluded that the two bite marks matched, and Robert was charged with and found guilty of killing Barbara. Initially given the death penalty, Robert's sentence was changed to life in prison with an extra 15 years in 1988. In order to challenge his conviction, Robert contacted the Innocence Project and denied any role in the murder. In 2020, the Innocence Project team used DNA found from Barbara's body at the time to compare Robert's DNA and, in a shocking turn of events, it didn't match. After serving 37 years in jail for the murder of Barbara, Robert was found to have been falsely imprisoned and was later exonerated. It was then discovered that beeswax, which was not a suitable material for dental molds, was used to create the mold that was obtained from Robert's teeth. Earlier, Dr. Richard claimed that the suspect would have a missing front tooth or a gap between his teeth, two characteristics that Robert didn't have. Even worse, a different dentist later looked at Barbara's wound through some available photos and found that it wasn't even a bite mark at all. The district attorney of Hillsborough County launched an investigation to find out who was to blame for Barbara's demise. The Conviction Review Unit, CRU, was launched by the 13th Judicial Circuit in order to review similar types of cases which needed to be reviewed again, such as cases which were wrongfully convicted by the jurisdiction. The Conviction Review Unit and the Innocence Project were able to perform DNA testing on this case widely with the help of the local Tampa Police Department and local Innocence Project of Florida. After some detailed DNA testing on some websites in 2022, the Conviction Review Unit and Innocence Project gave important information to the district attorney which changed the case completely. They discovered that two individuals, not one, were responsible for Barbara's murder, as well as a number of other crimes committed in the Tampa area throughout the 1980s. Amos Robinson, 58, and Abram Scott, 57, were discovered to be guilty not only just for the killing of Barbara Grams, but also for the 39-year-old cold case of Linda Lanson, which occurred just 1 month before Barbara's case. DNA matches established this information. Both were already serving life terms for the murders of Herminia Castro and Carlos Oriana, which occurred within months of the murders of Linda and Barbara. Both of the men were involved in Herminia and Carlos' case, just like they were in Barbara and Linda's case. Robinson has murdered 2 other convicts and is currently serving 3 life sentences for first and second-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Scott is currently serving a life sentence in prison for first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and burglary. On July 17, 2007, at about 1:20 a.m., there was a disturbing 911 call that went through to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. On the call, a landlord reported a fatal altercation that had taken place between him and a tenant. The deputies from the sheriff's office set off immediately for the scene of the crime. When they arrived at Nature's Trail Mobile Home Park, they came upon a horrific crime scene. The park was located off Morris Bridge Road at Thanodisasa in Hillsborough County, Florida. The landlord who had made the call was Jonathan Burns, a 43-year-old man who co-owned the park while also living within it. He told the deputies the same story he told the operator on the 911 call, of how he got into a fight with a female tenant and that he killed her in self-defense. He claimed that it was his tenant who attacked him first, and he showed the deputies 2 stab wounds to his abdomen as proof of this claim. He then led the deputies to the scene of the crime, which was outside the trailer of the tenant, Tanya and Ottman. There they found her lifeless body lying on her back and covered in blood. She had 4 stab wounds to her chest and a large laceration across her neck. Deputies found a blood trail in the same area near a dumpster, only about 29 feet away from the dead body. When they followed the blood trail, they found that it ended inside Burns' trailer. When they searched his trailer, they also found the murder weapon, a knife still covered with the blood of the victim. While Toyna's body was taken to the medical examiners for an autopsy, Burns went to the hospital to have his wounds treated. At the Tampa General Hospital, the doctors who treated Burns told him that the knife wounds to his abdomen would require surgery. They also found that other than the knife wounds, his arms were covered with scratches similar to those that would have been found if someone was defending themselves from an attacker. Tanya's autopsy did not give the detectives much new evidence to work with except for confirming that the cause of death was, in fact, the stab wounds to her chest, as these had pierced her lungs and her heart. From what Burns had told the detectives, it would seem like this case was an open and shut case of self-defense. However, some of the details he gave detectives did not match the evidence they'd found. This raised doubts in their minds as to whether or not he was actually telling the truth. When they tested the blood on the murder weapon, as well as the blood found near the crime scene, both came back as a match for Burns' DNA profile. However, contrary to Burns' story, Burns' blood was not found near Ottman's body and Ottman's blood was not found near the dumpster. Detectives also learned that most of the time Tanya had to use a walker or was in a wheelchair, as she had a disability that made it difficult for her to walk on her own. With this condition, it was doubtful that she would have been able to attack someone on her own, especially with the intent or ability to seriously injure them. At the time, in February 2007, investigators wanted to charge Burns with murder as they were highly suspicious of his claim that he acted in self-defense. However, the state attorney's office concluded that there was insufficient evidence to refute Burns' version of events when they were presented with the case. As detectives did not have any solid evidence to go against Burns' claims at the time, they had to let the case go, and eventually it turned cold. It would remain dormant for another 14 years. Then finally, in 2021, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began reviewing the case in the hopes of finding new clues. After taking another close look at all the circumstantial and physical evidence, a detective went to Burns' home on January 14, 2022 to interview him about the events surrounding Toynja's stabbing. When he recounted the details of that dreadful night, Burns gave the detective the same information. He said he had been drinking heavily when he heard Toynja begin to scream at him without any sort of provocation from his side. At first he had only walked to the laundry room to close the door, but then he decided to confront her. He said that when he walked over to her trailer, Toyna punched him hard in the stomach. He said that at that moment he did not notice anything, but soon after he realized he was bleeding and began to panic. Strangely, he also said that Toynja was not armed with any sort of knife or weapon and never took his knife from him, but somehow she managed to stab him. Due to the inconsistent evidence he was providing them, detectives were fairly sure that Burns was lying. However, as they began to plan as to how to build a stronger case, they got an unexpected lucky break. A little over a week after that interview, an unnamed witness contacted the sheriff's office saying that she had information on a cold case from February 2007. When she was interviewed by the police, she told them that on the day of the murder 14 years prior, Burns had approached her in the mobile home park just after the detectives left. He had then gone on to tell her that he knew he did something wrong. He also claimed that he was confessing because he wanted to face what he'd done. The witness also said that Burns told her he knew Tanya was disabled at the time of her death. Finally, She told them that Burns had given her a signed letter which had all the details of the incident, and she handed this in to the detectives. Only 2 days after this, the witness once again contacted the police. This time she told them that Burns himself had approached her again and had said that he had written the letter in an attempt to prove that he was acting in self-defense. He said that he had done this because he hoped to receive no punishment for a self-defense case rather than a first-degree murder. The witness also revealed that he told her he had no regrets for what he had done and that he had said that Toyna got what she deserved, indicating that he hated the woman. A few days later, on January 28, 2022, the witness once again contacted the detective stating that Burns had given her another signed letter, but the details in this were contradictory to the first one he had provided. There were differences between this new letter and his verbal descriptions of the event as well. Finally, in February 2022, the detectives were once again contacted by the witness, who told them that Burns had provided her with yet another statement, this time because she confronted him about the contradictions present between his previous letters and verbal accounts. During this confrontation, she told detectives her son had also been present, and they had both asked Burns how he'd been stabbed that day 14 years ago. Burns this time gave them the whole truth. He confessed to the witness and her son that on the day of the murder, he had noticed Tonya when he was walking to the laundry room. He returned home to go get his knife as he intended to seriously harm her when he walked over to talk to her. He said an argument broke out between them that led them to fighting over the knife, and when Tonya tried to leave to go home, he stabbed her several times and then cut her throat. After this, to set up the self-defense scenario, he stabbed himself in the stomach twice. Burns gave the witness a third written statement with all of this information, saying it contained the truth. This third letter ended with an admission from Burns that he hated Toyna and intended to deliberately hurt her that night and ended up killing her. The details in this third statement were consistent with evidence collected at the crime scene, and investigators matched a latent fingerprint on one of the statements to Burns. This was finally enough evidence to make a case against him, and they arrested him for murder. In a statement Burns provided after his arrest, he said, "This was a terrible tragedy that I am responsible for. I wish I could change it." Whether this remorse was real or not, on February 3, 2022, authorities took him into custody and charged him with Toyna's murder. Carol Jean Pierce was born as Carol Jean Fillion on December 4, 1939, to parents Pauline Eleanor Knapp Fillion and Raymond Joseph Fillion. The family lived a simple and humble life in Wisconsin, with Carol excelling at school, especially in the school band. In 1957, she married Danny Dean August, but the marriage did not last long. In 1958, she divorced August and would go on to wed Dr. Jock D. Clark in 1960. The two bore a son together, Mark Clark, but divorced soon after in 1964. Carol was now a single mother, looking for stability for herself and her baby. On September 3, 1966, 35-year-old Carol Jean married the love of her life, Richard Pierce. Pierce was active in the U.S. Coast Guard, and as a result, the two often moved around the U.S. Finally, in 1973, the two settled down at the Sunrise Shores Trailer Park in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. Richard had been assigned to work on the USCGC Mesquite long-term. Carol was excited about finally being able to put down some roots and began contemplating what the future might look like. Carol was said to be utterly devoted to her son Mark from her previous marriage. She felt her purpose in life was to take care of Mark in the home, and she happily slipped into the role of a stay-at-home mother and wife. But not all that glitters is gold. Whilst Carol and Richard lived like an idyllic couple to the outside world, trouble was brewing within the marriage. Neighbors would report hearing the screams and shouts of Carol and Richard as they were embroiled in intense arguments. Richard could often be heard belittling Carol, and soon the arguments turned physical. Carol was often seen around the trailer park with black eyes and a battered body. A concerned neighbor who worked as an X-ray technician saw Carol's injuries one day and offered to help her. When he asked her how she'd sustained the injuries, she fell quiet before telling him that she'd fallen. Given his medical experience, the neighbor didn't believe Carol's story, but there was nothing he could do. On one occasion, Carol told another neighbor, "Richard is going to kill me." As Carol refused to call the police or press charges, there was nothing anybody at the trailer park could do but watch as Carol slowly lost the battle. The arguments and beatings continued for years, all while Carol worked desperately to maintain a perfect image. Richard was close to retiring from the U.S. Coast Guard, and Carol had been saving away 35 cents at a time in order to buy him a ring as a surprise. The two also entered marriage counseling, which did little to quell the fighting. As part of Richard's retirement, the two had planned to find a fresh start once again and move to Sheboygan, Michigan. Yet, before Carol got the chance to experience farm life, she mysteriously vanished. According to Richard, before she left, she withdrew $20,000 from their savings account and signed over the titles to some land and a truck. Sources are conflicted, but either September 1975 would mark the last day that Carol was ever seen alive at her home on West Elm Street and Avenue, Sturgeon Bay. In Richard's version of events, he left for work as usual that morning, and when he returned around 4 p.m., she was gone. Interestingly, on September 5, 1975, Richard and the crew of the USCGC Mesquite were docked in Chicago. That day, Richard was given leave and returned on September 6. 2 weeks after Carol was last seen, Richard officially retired from the U.S. Coast Guard, and his friends and family threw him an extravagant retirement party. Glasses clinked and chatter filled the air, but one voice was missing: Carol. Carol had seemingly been excited about planning the party in the lead-up to his retirement. Carol's mother, who was in attendance, immediately noticed that her daughter was missing. When confronted, Richard told Carol's mother that she had simply taken off. Richard would maintain this version of events for decades. He even nonchalantly told his colleagues that Carol Jane had walked out on him. It wasn't until Carol's mother discovered that she was not at the party that she was officially reported missing to the Sturgeon Bay Police Department. Unfortunately, the SBPD showed little interest in Carol's case. As far as they were concerned, she was an unhappy housewife who left of her own volition to start a new life. Carol's mother knew her daughter would never leave her family behind, especially her son Mark. Her son, Mark Clark, later told Oxygen she would have never run away or done this disappearing act or sacrificed her own family on her own. This was out of character. She was a fighter. Richard murdered her. The case didn't gain the traction it deserved until the mid-1980s, by which time her family felt it was too late. Shortly after Carol's disappearance, Richard moved the trailer the two had shared to a farm in Sheboygan, Michigan. A month later, Rose Marlene Box moved into Richard's trailer. 2 years later, in 1977, Richard divorced Carol Jean and married his new girlfriend, Rose. When investigators finally dived into Carol's disappearance, they discovered that she had left almost everything behind. Her purse, makeup, her 1970 Chevy pickup, and her beloved cat had all been left behind at the trailer. The working theory that she had voluntarily walked away was shattered, and the SBPD began considering other options. Progress was slow, and Carol's family were unhappy with the SBPD's initial response. In February 2008, the SBPD teamed up with investigators in Sheboygan, Michigan to conduct a search of Richard's property and land. Investigators believed that Richard had killed Carol and buried her somewhere in the Michigan home. Deputy Ronald Fenlon of the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office helped lead the investigation, taking them deep into Richard's home's crawlspace. Fenlon would also later testify in court that during his February 2008 search, he discovered a cut in the concrete that had been filled with rocks and dirt. When he returned 10 years later in February 2018, the cut was no longer filled in. In February 2018, the Wisconsin Cold Case Review looked at Carol's case and determined there was enough to show that Richard was set to gain from Carol's disappearance. By February 2018, crime scene investigation techniques had come on leaps and bounds, and the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Office brought a K-9 unit to Richard's home. According to court documents, the dogs, trained to pick up the smell of human remains, alerted 6 times to the presence of human remains in the home. An excavation was performed on one of these sites. However, to this day, Carol's remains have never been found. In October 2018, 82-year-old Richard Gale Pierce was arrested and charged with the murder of his ex-wife Carol. The criminal complaint filed by the Door County Circuit Court stated, upon review of this case, the team concluded that the defendant, Richard, gained numerous things based on Carol Jean's disappearance, which included a pension unencumbered by a wife, most of the important belongings of their marriage, land in a home in Michigan, a new girlfriend weeks after Carol Jean's disappearance, as well as the benefit of Carol Jean's silence. In 2022, 86-year-old Richard Gale Pierce appeared at the Door County Court where the defense and prosecution laid out their arguments. Richard's defense argued that they could not prove that he had killed Carol without a body. The prosecution provided evidence from the searches of Richard's home and detailed all the things he stood to gain in Carol Jean's absence. It took the jury 10 hours to deliberate, and after consideration, they found Richard Gale Pierce guilty for first-degree murder and disinterment of the dead. Richard will now spend the rest of his natural life in prison serving a life sentence. In 1985, Karen Swift graduated from Walnut Ridge High School, Arkansas, and began to forge her own path. Those who knew Karen at school described her as witty and strong-willed. She was known to be full of life, but that all changed when she met her future husband, David Swift. The two moved to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and got married. Shortly after their union, the dynamic of their relationship changed significantly. One friend told the police that they'd noticed how much Karen had changed at their school reunion. She was still her lively self. That was until David spoke up. Those around her watched as David told her precisely what to do and that he expected her to follow his instructions. This level of control gradually wore Karen down, but she tried to maintain a happy and outgoing personality for the sake of her 4 children. Even though friends had noticed a considerable change in Karen's character, the two stayed together. Karen was known to be a devoted and caring mother to her 4 children, and those around her knew she would never abandon them. So when she disappeared from a Halloween party in February 2011, her friends knew something was wrong. On the evening of October 29, 2011, Karen attended a Halloween party hosted at the Farms Country Club in Dyersburg, Tennessee, with 2 friends, Bill and Kathy Bona. Those in attendance said that Karen seemed normal and there was no indication of what was to come. By 12 a.m., the party had wound down and everyone was ready to head back home to get some rest. It's believed that Karen headed home for a short period of time, as at around 1 a.m., she received a call from her daughter, Ashley. Ashley explained to her mother that she was at a sleepover but didn't feel well and needed her to come and pick her up. Karen swung her car around and headed for the house that Ashley was at. After collecting her daughter, the two returned home and climbed into bed together. According to reports, after around 30 minutes, Karen carried Ashley into her other daughter's room so that she wouldn't have to sleep alone for the night. Karen put her 2 daughters to bed at around 3 a.m., and after that, she vanished into thin air. Her husband, David, is believed to have been the last person in the home to see Karen before she went missing. The next morning, the Swifts awoke and immediately noticed Karen's absence. David turned the entire house upside down looking for his beloved wife. Neighbors confirmed that he went around the estate knocking on doors and shouting Karen's name. Concerned residents crept out of their homes to see what the commotion was, and that was when they learned that Karen had disappeared in the night. Later that day, Karen's 2004 Nissan Murano was found abandoned about a mile away from her home. The car had a flat tire that was caused by a drywall screw. Karen's Halloween costume was still inside, but her purse was missing. These revelations made the knot in David's stomach tighter. And that afternoon, he contacted the Dyer County Sheriff's Office to report his wife missing. The Dyer County Sheriff's Office responded immediately, and the search for Karen began. Investigators began performing a forensic sweep of the home, but found little to no clues. It was almost as if Karen had vanished into thin air. David told investigators that it was common for Karen to leave home to visit friends, but investigators didn't believe she would leave early in the morning to see someone. David became a prime suspect and the search for Karen continued. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation also joined the search for Karen, deploying officers, dogs, and helicopters to try and find her. Days into the investigation, detectives learned that in the months before her disappearance, 44-year-old Karen was in the process of filing for divorce. It's unclear whether David was aware that he was about to be served with divorce papers, but investigators saw it as a motive to want to get rid of her. The search for Karen would come to a grinding halt on December 10, 2011, when hunters found her body in some bushes in a cemetery in Dyersburg. The discovery rocked the town and people poured into the Swift home to offer their condolences. Karen's cause of death wouldn't be revealed until many years later. The coroner determined that Karen had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and several fractures to her body. The report also noted that Karen was found to be partially clothed, indicating a possible assault. To the outside world, David Swift was a grieving husband who had been left behind with 4 children. But deep down, he was hiding a dark secret. Carol Johnson, Karen's mother, told Oxygen. Since that time, he's never picked up the phone and called and asked about the investigation. To me, if it was my wife that had been murdered, I'd be burning the phone up every day for answers. Whilst David maintained his family man persona to the community, the Dyersburg Police Department was making waves in their investigation. The investigation would be slow and multiple searches of David's home were performed without arrest. But finally, in 2022, David Swift was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Karen Smith. In the years since Karen's murder, David moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and remarried. He had forged a new life for himself, trying to bury the old one deep in his conscience. The arrest came after the Dyersburg Police Department handed the case over to the District Attorney General's office in 2019. The Dyersburg sheriff told NBC that all of the evidence pointed to David, so it was easy to rule out everyone else as a suspect. They also commented that they believed the jury had made the right decision in charging him with premeditated first-degree murder. David Swift is currently being held without bail by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Birmingham, Alabama, and will be extradited to Tennessee to face the charges. The case against David is currently ongoing, and he's set to appear in court in 2023. If found guilty, David Swift could face a life sentence without parole. On February 14, 2017, the bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were found near the same hiking trail that they had gone missing on the day before. This case takes us to Delphi, Indiana, a small town in Indiana just under 3 square miles in size, and with a population of only around 3,000 people. Abigail Abby Joyce Williams and Liberty Libby Rose German were a pair of best friends from Delphi, Indiana. Abby was born on the June 23, 2003, while Libby was around 6 months older than her, having been born on the December 27, 2002. At the time of their tragic demise, Abby was 13 and Libby was 14 years old. They both attended the Delphi Community Middle School, which was where they met each other and became best friends. They bonded over shared love of the outdoors, with both of them loving activities such as camping, hiking, and swimming. They were always together, and in 2017, they were in the 8th grade and both were very excited about starting high school the next year. The duo were always planning out the next 4 years of their lives together. They imagined a happy, bright future where they could grow up together. But sadly, this would never come to be. On February 13, 2017, the two girls had planned to take a hike on the Monon High Bridge Trail, which is part of the Delphi Historic Trails in rural Delphi, Indiana. Normally, they would have been accompanied by an adult, but as the girls were almost in high school now, they were allowed to go on their own for the hike. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. They were dropped off near the start of the trail on County Road 300 North, east of the Hoosier Heartland Highway, by Libby's older sister, Kelsey German, at 1:35 p.m. on February 13th. The girls were having a fun time to start with, and at 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a video of Abby walking over the bridge. This was the last time either of them was ever heard from. They were supposed to meet Libby's father at 3:15 p.m., but when they did not show up, he knew something was wrong, as he was sure that the girls would never intentionally miss their deadline to meet him. Their families were terrified that something horrible had befallen the two young girls, so they first searched for them on their own. But then, when they could not find a single trace of the two girls, they reported them missing to the police at 5:30 p.m. that day. Initially, authorities did not suspect foul play as the reason for the disappearance, believing it was possible that the two young girls had simply wandered off the hiking trail and gotten lost in the wilderness. However, when the bodies of the two girls were found the next day at noon around half a mile east of the abandoned Monon High Bridge on the north bank of the Deer Creek, everyone's worst fears were realized. Police have still not released details of how the girls were murdered. In fact, very few details were released to the public regarding how and what state the girls were found in. However, one of the details that was released is the fact that there was video recovered from one of the victims' phones that helped police identify the suspect. A still image taken from this video was released in the hopes that someone could identify the killer. A composite sketch was also released to the public. On July 1737, officers distributed a composite sketch of someone who, at the time of the investigation, was sought as a person of interest in the murders. It had apparently been composed by the police from eyewitness accounts of a certain hiker who was seen on the Delphi historic trails on the day that the girls vanished. On April 19, 2019, the Indiana State Police announced a new direction in the case. Superintendent Doug Carter released more materials a few days later in a press conference held on April 22. The new materials included a short video recording in which the blue-jeaned and jacketed suspect is seen walking along the bridge for a little over a second. An updated sketch of the suspect was also unveiled, and an extended version of the audio recording in which a slight rise in the suspect's voice can be detected as he utters the word "guys" before the phrase "down the hill." The updated sketch raised some eyebrows as it appeared to be of a much younger man than the original sketch had been. These clips, when released to the public, brought in a huge number of tips from citizens trying to help. However, investigators were unable to use them to narrow their focus onto any real suspect in the case. The police, however, did find a few suspects over the course of the investigation. One such suspect was a registered offender from Indiana who was arrested in Woodland Park, Colorado in September 2017 and charged with threatening strangers on a monument trail with a hatchet. But in early February 2018, authorities said this suspect was no longer considered an active person of interest in the Delphi murders. Another one of these suspects was Paul Eder, who was wanted for the kidnapping and assault of a 26-year-old woman on June 22 in Tippecanoe County. Police thought it was possible he could be linked to this crime as well, considering his past. On June 27, 2019, Paul was confronted and surrounded by the police, but after a 5-hour standoff, he killed himself to avoid being arrested. 27-year-old Keegan Klein was also a suspect in the case. A man with a number of charges against him, Keegan was a prime suspect for police at the time and was arrested in 2020. In his interrogation, police learned that Klein had communicated with Libby German the day before her murder and on the day of the killing. However, in the end, police could find no evidence that Klein had actually met Libby and Abby. He's only been charged with related offenses and not the murder of the two girls. It was only in 2022, 5 years after the murder had taken place, that the police finally made an arrest in the case. The man police believe is the perpetrator is Richard Allen, a native of Delphi, who owned a number of guns and other weapons and was also on the same trail as the girls on that afternoon in 2017. In fact, Allen was interviewed by the police in 2017 as well, and even admitted to being on the same trail the afternoon of the murders, but at the time police did not have any evidence linking him to the crime. However, in 2022, new evidence which had not been released to the public led police to circle back to Allen as a suspect for the crime. In an October 13, 2022 interview, Allen told police he saw the juvenile girls on the trails east of Freedom Bridge and said he went on to the Monon High Bridge near where the girls were killed. In November of 2022, 50-year-old Allen was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He entered a not guilty plea but will soon face trial to determine his guilt. One of the few pieces of information that was released to the public was the fact that an unspent round was discovered near the bodies of the girls. An unspent bullet is one that has the casing and the projectile still together, and this usually happens if the bullet is faulty or the gun jams while firing. The round that was found near the girls was matched to a .40 caliber gun that Allen owned, placing him at the scene of the crime. Other than this, details about the case remain scarce. We hope the families of the girls get some form of closure from knowing that the man who allegedly took their children from them is now being made to pay the price for his actions. Anna Jean Kane was born in 1962 in Reading, Pennsylvania. She was raised in a chaotic household. She adored her 2 sisters, Jean Marie Camacho and Deborah J. Carter Jane, with all of her heart. Despite Sylvia Fern Kane's efforts to give her children a decent life, Anna did not have one. Anna was subjected to physical abuse from her father at a young age. Low family money and physical abuse all contributed to Anna's drug addiction. It was unknown how Anna got pregnant, but she had 3 little children, 1 daughter and 2 sons. Anna started working as a sex worker since she had a family to support. She spent several years working in the Reading region. Anna was by no means a perfect citizen given the lifestyle she led. She was arrested numerous times for performing sexual services and petty theft, but she genuinely cared about her children and wanted them to do better. Anna and her children frequently had to relocate due to her line of work. In 1988, Anna Kane relocated to Birdsboro in Pennsylvania's Berks County and soon found herself struggling to make ends meet. Tamika, the eldest daughter, was 9 years old at the time. After a happy meal on October 22, 1988, Tamika, Anna's eldest child, pleaded with her mother not to leave the house. She was unaware of any impending occurrences. She only had an awful feeling and wished her mother were still nearby. Anna made the decision to go against the pleas of her daughter. She promised her daughter she'd return shortly after going to the supermarket, but instead she went to Reading in search of a client. That evening, when Tamika called her mother, Anna informed her that she was heading home. It was the last time Tamika would ever hear her mother's voice. On October 23, 1988, at around 1 a.m., someone saw Anna in Reading's red light area between Franklin Street and South 6th Street. This was the last time she'd be seen alive. The next morning, a Perry resident was out on his own and came across something strange on the side of the Anteloni Trail in a rural area close to Route 662. He took a closer look and saw that it was a human body. The face was badly bruised, and the person appeared to have been battered and strangled with baling twine. It was a horrifying find. The local man became alarmed and dialed 911. When police arrived on the site, they recognized Anna Jean Kane's body. Although there wasn't much evidence at the scene, Anna's clothing provided DNA samples. The investigators started looking for clues once Anna was brought to the coroner's office for examination. Asphyxiation caused by strangling was identified as the cause of death following the autopsy. According to the report, Anna had already been dead for more than 12 hours when her body was discovered. DNA technology was not as developed back then as it is now. When the DNA extracted from Anna's clothing was examined, it was found to have an indeterminate male profile and no match. Anna's family was devastated and wanted explanations, but there were no hints as to what had occurred that tragic night. When there were initially no suspects in sight, investigators were put in a difficult situation. It was difficult to identify suspects in this case because Anna was constantly exposed to danger due to her line of work. It was also unclear why this murder was committed. A closer look at the body indicated that she had not been sexually assaulted. Therefore, it was clear that it was not even sexually motivated. They speculated that Anna's face might have been injured as a consequence of a struggle between her and her attacker. Although Anna Kane's case did not get much media attention, the Reading Eagle, a local newspaper, published a front-page story seeking information about Anna Jean Kane soon after the murder. Oddly enough, just 15 months later, in February 1990, the newspaper received an anonymous letter from a concerned citizen. This letter contained a lot of details about the murder never released to the public, which led investigators to believe the killer had sent it. Detectives collected DNA from the saliva that was used to seal the letter sent to the newspaper. When it was tested, it matched the DNA found on Anna's clothes, which confirmed their suspicion of the murderer sending the letter. However, since they had no idea who the DNA belonged to, nothing came out of this and the case went cold. DNA technology has greatly improved over time. The Pennsylvania State Police Department transferred the DNA it had extracted from the newspaper letter and Anna Kane's clothing to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for DNA profiling after years of working on the unsolved murder of Anna Kane in 2022. A match was eventually discovered by detectives using genetic genealogy. Scott Grimm was identified as the killer of Anna Kane. Later, detectives claimed that they had obtained the murderer's distant relative's DNA. However, they did not specify how they did so. Officials stated that Scott Grimm resided in the same neighborhood in 1988, but they had not yet discovered any connections between Grimm and Anna. At a press conference, Trooper Daniel Womer of the Pennsylvania State Police clarified, "That doesn't mean there wasn't some connection we haven't uncovered yet." Detectives claim that Scott Grimm had never been recognized before because his DNA was not stored in the criminal database in the early 1990s because he'd never been charged with a crime. He had been arrested in the past for harassing a former business partner in February 2002, but his DNA was never collected. Scott Grimm sadly passed away in February 2018 at the age of 58 from natural causes, and so he could never be brought to justice. After waiting for decades, Anna Kane's family could finally get some closure, though they were understandably disappointed that the killer would not face any form of justice. Tamika, now 43, said, "I didn't think I'd see this day, but I had hope. My emotions are all over the place. Happy, sad, and angry." Shannon Lloyd, then 23 years old, was a renter in a Garden Grove house in California in 1987. She was full of adventure even at a young age, having visited numerous U.S. cities. It was common knowledge that she was a self-proclaimed tomboy who had a soft spot for equines. On May 21, 1987, she was found dead in her bathroom. The autopsy revealed that she was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The California Police Department failed to find any solid leads into her case. The investigation continued, but the police were constantly failing. They interviewed almost every person who was related to Shannon Lloyd, but didn't receive anything tangible to follow. The case was slowly growing cold. But suddenly, the California Police Department were alert again when they were informed of another case which was similar to Shannon's. In 1989, they received reports of the murder of Renee Cuvis. Renee Cuvis, a 27-year-old mother of two, was a neighbor of Shannon's. For Renee, her children were everything. Renee wasn't rich, but she took care of her children in the best possible way she could. Sadly, she wasn't aware what her fate was and how her life would soon end before its time. On the morning of February 19, 1989, her body was found on Lambert Road in Irvine, California near El Toro Marine Base. The murder investigation was kept under wraps by the police. They were not able to find any suspect or even evidence. Their constant hard work wasn't producing the results they wanted, but the style of killing and how the victims were found indicated that the murderer was likely the same for both the victims. For a long period of time, the killings of Shannon and Renee were not being investigated further as the police ran out of leads to chase. The cases went cold. The next step occurred in February 2003 when the criminal's DNA was placed into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Despite this, they were still unable to identify Renee's murderer, and the investigation was ultimately closed without any arrests being made. It took investigative genetic genealogy technology for the detectives working for the Orange County DA to identify a suspect in the killings of Renee and Shannon in 2021. He was Reuben Smith. Although he was born in Michigan, Reuben J. Smith spent the 1980s in Orange County, California. He was jailed in 1998 for sexually assaulting and attempting to kill a lady in Las Vegas. After his arrest, he had to give a DNA sample to officials who entered him into a database. By comparing the samples, detectives in the year 2022 were able to positively identify Reuben as the culprit of the crimes against Renee and Shannon. Unfortunately, Smith shot himself in the head in July 1999 at the age of 39, long before he would have faced justice for the assault on the third unnamed lady. Police are looking into the possibility that he had committed more crimes. The Backett County Sheriff's Office answered a call from a Colorado farm on June 3, 1988. About 20 miles southeast of the town of Springfield in Backett County, Colorado, a local farmer notified the local sheriff's office that he discovered what he thought to be human remains on his farm. The remains were identified as human where they were observed by the then Sheriff Willard Goff and then Coroner Robert Morrow and other deputies. The remains consisted of what was most of the human skeleton, but the bones were not all there, and what was there was white and bleached. The investigators then searched the area for leads, while the remains were taken to the coroner's office for an autopsy. Sadly, They were unable to uncover any evidence that would have allowed them to identify the victim. With the help of the farm owner, personnel from the Backett County Sheriff's Office and Coroner's Office spent several days searching the land. They recorded a number of things discovered there and tested the local soil for possible proof. Nothing, however, was discovered to help identify the bones, ascertain how or why the individual had died, or explain how they'd ended up in the farmer's field. Following a forensic examination, it was determined that the victim was a female between the ages of 19 and 24. She weighed about 130 pounds and was between 5'2" and 5'4" tall. Her hair was brown, but the decayed remains made it impossible to tell what color her eyes were. She was dressed in a beige winter coat with a white synthetic fur collar and 4-inch fur cuffs, gray corduroy Levi jeans with the leg cuffs hemmed up to a 27.5-inch inseam, and a 34B bra. Although the victim displayed characteristics of Hispanic or Latino, Native American and European people, forensics were unable to identify her ancestry. She had substantial dental treatment, including 2 silver cast crowns on her left side, which suggested that she might be Mexican or have grown up close to the border. Her body's internals gave away the possibility that she'd never given birth. Additionally, it was determined that she'd passed away between 1 and 3 years before the discovery of her remains, and the cause of her death was determined to be suspicious, most likely a homicide. Authorities at the time were unable to locate any of the victim's family members to return her remains to, since she remained unidentified. They referred to the victim as the Backett County Jane Doe due to the lack of a name. The original documents of Jane Doe's death were all retained at the sheriff's and coroner's offices, and she was buried in the Springfield Cemetery. Numerous efforts were made throughout the years to identify her. In an effort to find a match within the missing persons database, dental impressions and records of the victim were submitted to the National Crime Identification Center. Despite the fact that DNA was still in its infancy at the time when it comes to victim identification, DNA samples were also collected and submitted for processing. The body's remains were subjected to an anthropological investigation to learn more about any potential clues on the body that would help identify it. To gain a better picture of what the person may have looked like, investigators also created a facial reconstruction. To pinpoint the deceased's prior location before her passing, even the fillings in her teeth were examined. Numerous prospective matches, including probable dental matches, were obtained. But as the investigation went on, each one was eliminated after being compared to the remains. The public was invited to come forward with any information they might have about the victim during press conferences that investigators scheduled, but no one did. Thus, no conclusions could be made from those. The body remained unidentified and the case went cold in spite of the best efforts of the detectives. Finally, 3 decades later in 2021, the case was reopened when the Backett County Sheriff's and Coroner's offices were contacted by an investigative intern working for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. This intern wanted to submit the data from the case into NAMUS, a national database of missing and unidentified persons. It did not bring an immediate result, but the case got renewed attention, which also brought up other resources. Old case files were gone through and a genetic genealogy lab was contacted in the hopes of getting Jane Doe identified. However, they soon learned that the DNA reports they had collected in the initial investigation were not enough to conduct a familial DNA study, so Jane Doe's body had to be exhumed to get fresh samples. The Backpack County Sheriff's Office was informed by NAMUS about the identification of a different familial DNA match for Jane Doe about a year later on September 26, 2022. The Texas resident who provided her DNA to the McAllen Police Department in 1996, despite the fact that she'd been missing since 1986 or 1987. The McAllen Police Department's report states that Nora Castillo's final communication with someone was a collect call made from someplace in Colorado just before she vanished. Nora Castillo's identity as the Jane Doe from Baca County was then established through additional DNA testing and analysis. As a child, Josie Castillo could not spend much time with her mother because her father had custody. Despite that, she recalled her as a vivacious individual who cherished laughter and a smile. Josie also recalled how social services became involved when Nora was having problems when she was 6 years old and her sister, Crystal, was 3. While they were living with their father in New Mexico, Nora made an effort to kidnap them, but she ended up in the Hobbs, New Mexico jail after getting into some problems. She allegedly went to a mental hospital after that, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her. After their mother mysteriously vanished, the girls spent years wondering where Nora was and how to find her. Finally, they had an answer. Along with Josie, her sister Crystal was also notified about their mother's final fate. Although their hope of ever getting their mother alive was shattered, they were happy to have a sense of closure after all those years of waiting. All this came out of absolutely nowhere, and it's a lot, Crystal stated. Despite seeking answers regarding what led to her mother's untimely demise, Josie said she can now go to sleep at night knowing where her mom is thanks to genetic genealogy. My heart is healing. There's a healing process now, Josie stated. The details of how Nora Elia Castillo died and why she was in Colorado are still under investigation. For now, this case is still being investigated as a potential homicide. The police have asked anyone having information regarding the case to come forward. Heather Ann Wilms was born in Texas in 1984 to Gordon Wilms and Donna Ellis. She was having a good time after studying at O'Connor High School in February 2001 and was going to San Antonio College and Texas Lutheran University for further studies. Amanda, Olivia, Michaela, Jackson, and Jason were her 5 siblings. Many of her siblings admired her, notably Jose Baldomero Flores, whom she and her family referred to as Joe. Heather and Jose met at O'Connor and had remained friends ever since. She frequently invited them to her family's home for dinner. Heather was scheduled to begin her shift as a waitress at Champ's Americana restaurant on February 21, 2005, but she never showed up. Her friends and family attempted to contact her but received no response. Heather's body was discovered inside her home the next morning. Her father and his friends discovered her in the bedroom of her Leon Valley apartment after she'd failed to show up for work the day before. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her murder left everyone stunned. The family contacted the Leon Valley Police Department to report the horrific discovery. The police reached her home and began their investigation. Their first objective was to get as much information as possible. The police interviewed her friends and family. However, no arrests were made and the police did not even identify a single suspect. Eventually, the case turned cold. 6 years later, the city witnessed another gruesome crime. On March 2, 2011, the city fireman team responded to an apartment fire in San Antonio, Texas. When they arrived and started putting out the fire, they discovered the body of a woman inside the flat. The San Antonio Police Department was contacted by the firefighting teams. Neighbors recognized the lady as 30-year-old Esmeralda Herrera after the police inquiry. She'd been cuffed, sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The police discovered that the fire was deliberately lit to destroy the evidence. However, the attempt failed because not all the evidence was destroyed. A forensic expert discovered unidentified DNA on a beer can in the kitchen as well as hairs and fibers and a bloody shoe print. Later, police discovered that Esmeralda had been conversing with one person on and off throughout the day, a friend called Jose Baldomero Flores, the same individual that had been Heather Wilms' close friend. Esmeralda's acquaintance told authorities that she'd known Jose for nearly a year. Esmeralda had told a friend the day before her death that Jose would be visiting her the next day. The police now had a suspect in the murder of Esmeralda. Based on the new findings, Jose was charged 6 weeks later. However, he was released only a month after that after the district attorney's office stated that more specific evidence was required to indict him. The police were constantly working on the case and trying to find the required evidence. It would be another 5 years before an arrest was made, this time with the assistance of the Texas Rangers. Though police did not release the evidence they found against him, Jose was arrested and charged not just with Esmeralda's murder, but also with Heather Wilms. 2 families were linked together by the crimes committed by someone both of their daughters knew and considered a friend. This was the most devastating aspect for the family because the horrible killings were not carried out by a stranger. They'd have to wait again, this time for justice, which would arrive in 2022. Jose accepted a plea deal just days before a jury was to be selected for one of his impending trials. Flores received 2 consecutive life sentences for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The family's initial demand was for a death sentence. The Herrera family had a letter read in court by a victim advocate in which they expressed their desire for Flores to suffer in jail. Flores is now serving his life terms at the Garza West unit in Beeville. Several news reporters attempted to speak to him, but he did not respond. On February 26, 1999, a body was found in a forest near a church cemetery in DeKalb County, Georgia. Locals were the first to discover the body and alerted the DeKalb Police Department. The remains were badly decomposed. After the initial investigation, the police were not able to find to whom the body belonged. The autopsy found that the body belonged to an African-American boy between the ages of 5 and 7. He'd also been dead for 3 to 6 months, according to their findings. He was dressed in a plaid blue and white shirt, red denim jeans, and brown Timberland boots. The brand name boots were detailed that became public throughout the years-long search for him. The investigators interviewed some locals, but no one was able to identify the body. Police didn't lose hope as they continued their investigation. Despite the immense efforts of the investigators, they found nothing. The case went cold for over 2 decades. Finally, after 23 years, a phone call changed the case completely and the authorities were able to identify the name of the body, which was released to the media in July 2022. The body was that of William Deshaun Hamilton. The persistence of 2 ladies who, for various reasons, never forgot the child helped to solve the mystery of William's identity. One was Ava, a friend of William's mother, Teresa and Bailey Black, who had formed an unbreakable bond with the youngster. The other was reporter Angeline Hartman, who covered the issue regularly over the years in the hope that someone would come forward and identify him. That happened in May 2020 when Ava, a Charlotte, North Carolina resident, called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and CMEC where Hartman worked and said she thought the remains discovered in Georgia were that of William. Her tip assisted investigators in solving the crime. Ava told A&E True Crime that she spent a lot of time with William when he and his mother resided 3 streets away from her in Charlotte. She babysat him daily before and after school for about 4 years and the two got quite close. She remembered him as a youngster who was cheerful, brilliant, and intelligent above his years. A boy who loved to read encyclopedias and was proud of his knowledge of big words. Although his mother was a friend, she was aloof and impatient with William. Eva remarked that she was not a caring or affectionate mother. According to investigators, Black withdrew William from school in Charlotte sometime in December 1998. Black informed Eva that she and her son were relocating to Atlanta, Georgia to be closer to family. Eva recalls saying goodbye to William clearly. She claimed that Black returned to Charlotte later that year but without William. In answer to Ava's increasingly anxious questioning, Black explained her son's absence in a variety of ways. Ava began looking for William after not receiving any responses. She copied Georgia phone numbers she found in phone books at the local public library. She contacted hospitals, police, homeless shelters, social assistance organizations, and transportation terminals. She did it every day, sometimes for hours, occasionally falling asleep surrounded by documents, she said. Ava eventually lost track of Black. Ava was married for 20 years and had 2 daughters. Nevertheless, she never gave up searching for William. She continued to search websites and make phone calls, and her girls grew up as if they too knew the tiny boy their mother had adored. Then one day in May 2020, Ava discovered a facial reconstruction rendering done by NCMEC of the young boy discovered in Georgia in 1999. Meanwhile, Angeline Hartman, the first reporter on the scene when William's bones were discovered, had never stopped doing everything she could to keep the matter in the public eye. Hartman worked as a crime reporter for Atlanta's Wagga TV for 6 years, during which time she extensively covered the case. She departed in February 2005 to work on America's Most Wanted, where she also covered the case. She eventually became the communications director of National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, commonly known as NCMEC, where she continued to ensure that William was not forgotten. Over time, experts generated various facial reconstruction representations of William. Hartman recalls how moving it was to see the first one unveiled in 1999. According to Hartman, the depiction was placed on a mannequin dressed in garments identical to those found with William's bones, including child-sized boots that she could readily envisage cradling tiny feet. NCMEC was also involved in the search for William, publicizing the case on its website and following up on leads. On the 20th anniversary of the boy's discovery, an NCMEC forensic artist prepared a new facial reconstruction representation in February 2019. Simultaneously, Hartman revisited the case in a new 6-episode series on her own podcast, Inside Crime with Angeline Hartman. The following year in 2020, during one of her countless searches, Ava came across Hartman's podcast, which led her to the February 2019 NCMEC rendering where she identified William. When I seen that picture, I just screamed and tears just start because I knew that was him. It was no doubt that was him. With the help of Eva and Hartman, the authorities were not only able to identify William, but his murderer too. It turns out his murderer was his own mother, Teresa and Bailey Black. In DeKalb County Superior Court in June 2022, Black was charged with 2 charges of felony murder, 2 counts of cruelty to minors, 1 act of aggravated assault, and 1 crime of concealing the death of another. According to Black's indictment, she gave William a substance or substances including diphenhydramine and acetaminophen, struck him in the head causing serious bodily damage, and neglected to seek medical assistance for him. She was apprehended in Arizona and extradited to Georgia. At her arraignment, she entered a preliminary plea of not guilty. As of December 2022, she was being held at Georgia's DeKalb County Jail waiting for her case to be placed on the court's pretrial calendar, according to DeKalb County Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney Shannon Hodder. According to her, the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office became engaged in the case when Ava contacted NCMEC with investigators flying to North Carolina and Arizona as part of their investigation. According to officials, DNA recovered from Black in early 2022 led to the boy's identity. Hodder was astounded by Ava's determination to never give up on locating William. Both commended NCMEC with evaluating tips and creating the groundwork for the case's resolution. Since meeting in July 2022, Ava and Hartman have become friends and plan to attend Black's murder trial. Ava says she was experiencing contradictory emotions after 23 years of seeking for William. She hopes to obtain permission to have William's ashes cremated and kept in her house. Eva has similar sentiments regarding Hartman's commitment to covering William's case. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office is still looking for anyone who may have known William Deshaun Hamilton or his mother, Teresa and Bailey Black. Born on April 27, 1956 to parents Doyle and Vanetta Matthews, Mary Robin Matthews, who went by Robin, grew up in a religious home in Kingman, Kansas alongside her 2 sisters, Danetta and Monica. Robin's childhood was spent in an idealistic home. Her parents doted on their 3 children and always tried to provide the best possible life for them. Robin was an easygoing and happy-go-lucky girl who cherished the company of her family and friends. Those who were close to Robin described her as a person who was beautiful both inside and out. The carefree Robin fell in love at a very young age when she met Douglas Walker, who went by Doug. Doug, who also grew up in the Kingman area, was 1 year older than Robin and felt the same way about her. After getting married in 1974, Robin formally became Mary Robin Walter. The newly married couple started their new chapter in life on a high note. Shortly after the wedding, Robin became pregnant with her only daughter, Pamela. While they were still young, both Doug and Robin decided to focus on their career. The couple moved to Great Bend, Kansas, a city of about 15,000 residents in central Kansas. They settled into a mobile home in Nelson Trailer Park located near the Great Bend Municipal Airport in the rural area of Great Bend. Initially, Doug intended to pursue a career in insurance but eventually abandoned the idea and went to work at his uncle's service station. Meanwhile, Robin decided to pursue nursing solely due to her longing to help people. She enrolled herself in Barton County Community College in Great Bend College, while also taking up a part-time job at the Great Bend Manor Hospital. Doug was extremely supportive of her studies and careers as much as he was dedicated to his own field of work. After some initial struggles, Robin and Doug were able to manage their daily schedule quite comfortably. By 1980, 4 years after moving to Great Bend, the couple was enjoying a good life. They put their time and effort into raising their daughter while also excelling in their respective workplaces. Robin was in her second semester of college by this point and relished being a mother. However, Robin's blissful life was about to come to a tragic end. January 24, 1980 started as a regular winter morning for the Walter family when Doug left home for work. Robin was supposed to attend her afternoon nursing class at 1 p.m., but she did not make it there, which was extremely unusual for her. The circumstances got stranger when Robin did not pick up their daughter, the then 5-year-old Pamela, from the babysitter's house at 3 p.m. as per the scheduled appointment. Doug, on the other hand, unaware of anything amiss at home, went to a club with friends after leaving the service station where he worked. The reason for Robin's absence both at her classes and at the babysitter's house would not be revealed until 6:40 p.m. that evening when Doug returned home along with one of his friends. Upon entering the house, both men walked into a scene straight out of a horror movie. 23-year-old Robin was lying motionless on the bed face up in a pool of her own blood. Devastated and heartbroken, Doug immediately called 911 while still numb from the shock of what had happened. It did not take long for the officers from the Barton County Sheriff's Office to arrive at the home. While the body was sent to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, the officers began combing the house for clues. Inside the home, they found the murder weapon, a .22 caliber pistol which belonged to the Walters. It was concluded that the gun was loaded and emptied twice during the shooting. The autopsy report revealed that Robin had been shot 12 times in her neck, chest, abdomen, and arm. This was an extremely baffling case for the investigators. They were puzzled by the apparent lack of motive for the murder, as there was neither evidence of sex assault nor robbery in the home. Additionally, when Doug was questioned by police regarding his assumptions about the person responsible for his wife's death, he could not come up with an answer. He was unable to think of anyone who would want to harm Robin. However, he said that they never locked their doors and always left the keys in the car, as their neighborhood was generally considered pretty safe. Investigators interviewed several people in the neighborhood, but learned nothing of value regarding the killer's identity. Eventually, detectives zeroed in on a person of interest but could not make an arrest due to the lack of evidence. It's unknown why this man became a person of interest. At the time, they did not publicly name the suspect. With nothing tangible to connect the man to the murder, the case lay dormant for over 40 years. In April 2022, more than 4 decades later, while recovering from COVID, Detective Sergeant Adam Hales from the Barton County Sheriff's Office reopened the cold case. For days, he studied the case documents before a major clue caught his attention. Among thousands of documents, Detective Hales came across some incriminating information, some of which had been overlooked in the original investigation and some of which was added at a later date. Investigators never publicly revealed what the evidence exactly was. After reviewing the evidence, Hales gathered together a team of detectives to join him on the case. The team started interviewing multiple witnesses across the country who were involved in the original investigation. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation also assisted in the investigation. After months of hefty investigative work, investigators were able to successfully build a case based on the newfound evidence. In October 2022, detectives submitted the case to the attorney of Martin County Courthouse for review. After approximately 4 weeks of review, an arrest warrant was obtained for the suspect, who was finally identified as Robert Hanks. He was then formally charged with murder in the 2nd degree. Robert Hanks lived in the same neighborhood as the Walter family at the time of Robin's murder. It's not known why Hanks became a person of interest in the first place, but his long criminal history might be one of the reasons. Just a year after Robin's murder, Hanks was arrested and charged with sexual assault, aggravated battery, aggravated robbery, and aggravated burglary. He was convicted in 1983 and served about 8 years, but was paroled in 1993. Detectives concluded that Hanks, who was 25 at the time of Robin's slaying, broke into the Walter home and gunned down Robin on that fateful evening in 1980. However, his motive for the murder and whether he knew Robin beforehand is still unclear. On December 8, 2022, Barton police arrested now 68-year-old Robert Hanks from Oxford, Kansas. The outcome is bittersweet for Robin's daughter Pamela Walter Cooper, who still suffers from nightmares about her mother's horrific death. While she's happy that the alleged culprit has now been put away, she also regrets that many of her family members did not live to see this day. Robin's mother passed away in 2012, and her father soon followed in 2015. Doug passed away just a year earlier in 2021. Pamela also told the media that the family had always suspected Hanks of Robin's murder, even though he was never publicly named until last year. She further expressed that she's curious to know if he's remorseful for his actions. However, even if that's not the case, she stated that she personally has forgiven him a long time ago. This case stands at the oldest homicide in Kansas history, which ended with an arrest. Currently, Banks is being held in the Barton County Jail on a $500,000 bond. On June 1, 2018, an off-duty firefighter Chris Lemieux was out on his boat bait fishing with two of his buddies in the ocean, just north of the Boynton Beach Inlet in Palm Beach County, Florida. The boat was about 50 yards from the beach when they noticed a baby's body floating face down in the water. Lemieux quickly realized that it was a potential crime scene, so he did not attempt to touch the body. Instead, he called 911 and waited for authorities to arrive. Upon arriving, the deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office discovered that the body belonged to a healthy, full-term female child who was deemed to be under 14 old. The drift study later determined that the girl had been in the water for a day or two and her death was ruled a homicide. Despite no obvious signs of trauma on the body, the autopsy results suggested that the cause of death was suffocation. The report also suggested that the baby was seemingly born in a hospital since her umbilical cord was clipped, and there was evidence of a needle mark on her foot. Initially, detectives thought that the baby might have been of Caribbean descent due to the DNA tests defining her as being a 50-50 mix of African and Asian. Based on their theory, the local authorities contacted the Bahamas law enforcement but did not find any suspicious missing baby cases. It was also concluded that the baby most likely did not come from a boat carrying migrants. Surprisingly, they did not disclose what landed them to this conclusion. At this point, detectives working on the case were handed the daunting task of identifying the infant. To whom did the child belong? Who disposed of this poor baby like a piece of garbage? Detectives combed through 22 tips and searched more than 700 baby records from Broward and Palm Beach counties, but could not find a suitable match. Authorities urged the public for assistance, and a $10,000 reward was posted for anyone having significant evidence. However, this did not lead to any substantial leads. The baby's DNA was submitted to the Codys, but no likely match was produced. As days passed, the baby remained unclaimed and unidentified. The child would eventually become known as Baby June. Despite investigators' best efforts to locate the baby's parents, the case went cold just a few days after the discovery. It wasn't until 4 years later in 2022 that authorities finally caught a break in the case. In June 2022, the case was taken over by the Cold Case Unit of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office led by Detective Brittany Christohile. They sent Baby June's DNA to Parabon Nanolab, where it was entered into a public genealogy database. Luckily, a match came back to Baby June's first cousin once removed. From there, the investigators reverse-engineered the family tree and eventually tracked down the potential father of Baby June. The man, whose identity was never publicly revealed, was cooperative with investigators when they contacted him. After he was confirmed as Baby June's father by further DNA testing, he stated that he had no knowledge of the baby ever being born. However, the man pointed authorities to his ex-girlfriend, Arya Singh. The father told the detectives that he met Arya at Santa Luces High School in Lantana, where they both attended. They stayed together until September 2017. In May 2018, he said he moved to Tallahassee for work. Around the same time, he said his conversations with Arya again began over the phone. In August-September of 2018, he went to West Palm Beach to attend a concert with her. That's when Arya told him that she'd been pregnant during the February, but took care of it. He said he did not understand her statement, but assumed that she had an abortion. For days after the incident, He said he tried asking her about the baby, but she refused to speak about it, and eventually he dropped the matter. Concluding that the father had nothing to do with baby June's death, the detectives began closing in on 29-year-old Arya Singh in late July of 2022. After days of surveying, on August 14, 2022, detectives obtained DNA from a discarded coffee cup. The DNA on its rim confirmed that Arya was indeed the mother of baby June. Detectives then obtained a warrant to search through Arya's location data on her cell phone. This placed her right at the lifeguard station on North Ocean Boulevard in Ocean Ridge near the Boynton Beach Inlet around 9:35 p.m. on May 30, 2018, just 2 days before the infant's body was discovered. Her phone stayed there until 10:01 p.m. It was at 10:06 when the GPS coordinates showed her leaving the area. As investigators scanned through her Google searches around that time, even more incriminating details about her online activity were revealed. On May 30, 2018, at 8:41 a.m., just hours before her phone appeared at the Boynton Beach Inlet, investigators said Arya searched Google for cheap hotels near the area. The search included hotels in Boca Raton, Delray Beach, and Boynton Beach. Between 8:41 a.m. and 10:45 a.m., Singh made 8 searches for hotels. From May 30th to June 30th, 2018, there were 574 searches for Boynton Inlet. Just between May 30th at 11:20 p.m. and May 31st at 9:28 p.m., investigators found a total of 34 searches for Palm Beach County News. She also visited websites related to the Boynton Beach Inlet 27 times. Between June 1st and June 30th, she visited 64 articles about baby June on both local and national websites. Additionally, she even searched Google for the Cody's DNA database as well as her name Arya Singh and baby San Juan Trinidad. Detectives would later say that some of her family is from Trinidad. In September of 2022, deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office finally took Arya Singh into custody. At the time, she was working as a security guard at Lynn University in Boca Raton. They interviewed Arya as well as several of her family and friends to try to piece together the full story. When giving her account of the day, Arya said that on May 30, 2018, she went to a hotel room after not feeling well. She claimed that she didn't want to stay home in her state to bother anyone and avoid the questions they might ask. Then, in the hotel bathroom, Arya gave birth to a daughter. Arya further insisted that she did not have any knowledge of the pregnancy until the delivery. She claimed to have put the baby in a backpack believing she was stillborn, never checking up on her. She kept the backpack with her while she attended a class at Florida Atlantic University, but she was unsure about what to do with the baby's body. That same night, she went to the Boynton Beach Inlet and dumped the baby in the water. Chillingly, Arya also told investigators that she had never named her child. Although in the days and weeks after the incident, Arya closely followed the baby June story, she never came forward to claim her child. She reportedly had no other children. Detectives believe that the baby was born alive, but she was dead by the time she was placed into the water. Arya was eventually charged with the first-degree murder of her infant daughter. She pleaded not guilty in January of 2023. She's currently being held in Palm Beach County Jail pending trial. If convicted, she could face life in prison or even the death penalty. For 4 decades, John Bamford waited for justice to prevail. When he kissed his wife Evelyn goodbye before leaving for work, little did he think he'd return to a scene that changed his life forever. When he returned, the home he shared with her was cordoned off by police tape while officers searched the surrounding area. Not knowing what was happening, John walked in to find his home in disarray and the bed he once shared with his wife soaked in blood. The only questions were, why did this happen and who could have done this? Our case today takes us to Miramar, Florida. It's the perfect slice of paradise with tropical weather and pristine beaches. The city's motto, Beauty in Progress, has allowed it to maintain its laid-back beach resort charm while still being a progressive urban city. Visitors also get to enjoy a myriad of outdoor activities and soak up the Florida weather at its best. In 1980, Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamford called Miramar home. Born on March 23, 1947, Evelyn was raised alongside her brother Leonard by parents Charles and Ethel. The family lived in Sardis, a small community in the city of Chilliwack, British Columbia. Evelyn and her family were part of the Shackton First Nations tribe. She attended Chilliwack Secondary School and aspired to be a nurse. Her cousin, Stephen Point, described her as the starlight of the family. Evelyn was also a very intelligent young woman. She went on to graduate from the Riverview School of Psychiatric Nursing and began pursuing her career. She was a groundbreaker who paved her own way despite all the obstacles Indigenous people and women in particular faced at the time, said Point. Evelyn began working as a nurse in Vancouver soon after graduating, and it was here she would meet her future husband, John. On a night out with friends in 1969, Evelyn met John, who was a bartender at a local pub in Port Moody, British Columbia. The two had an instant connection. After a year of dating, though, he was offered a job as a beverage manager in the Grand Cayman Islands. The offer was too tempting to pass up, and with Evelyn's blessing, he left to begin his new post. However, the distance became too much, and after 6 months, Evelyn quit her job and joined John. They lived blissfully together for just over a year, but soon Evelyn started to feel the isolation of island living. Evelyn loved John, but she also enjoyed being an independent woman. She found herself needing to return to work, and so she left for Miami. Unable to be without her, John followed her 3 days later, and the couple decided to settle in Miramar, a suburb in Miami. They moved into a newly developed mobile home park called Haven Lake Estates, and it wouldn't be long before they were married. Both John and Evelyn settled into married life and work. They hadn't thought of starting a family just yet, though. After a few years of living alone together, they welcomed into their home a close friend of Evelyn's who had become their new housemate. Together, they lived in blissful harmony. Gene knew he had found his soulmate in Evelyn. "The first time I saw her, I fell for her, you know. She was just great to be around," he said. For almost a decade, the couple would call Lake Haven Estate their home. But it was here their peaceful existence came to a brutal end. On the evening of January 22, 1980, John kissed 32-year-old Evelyn goodbye and headed to work. Their housemate had also left to go out that evening. Evelyn was home alone, nothing out of the ordinary. She went about doing some everyday chores before retiring to bed for the night. She'd recently undergone knee surgery and was still in the process of recovering. At around midnight, her friend returned home. She'd forgotten her key and tried knocking on the door to wake Evelyn. After a while of getting no response, she started to panic. She called the police. When police eventually broke the door to enter the home, they walked into a scene straight out of a horror movie. The house was in disarray and it was deathly silent inside. Police made their way to the back bedroom, and there they found Evelyn. She lay dead in her bed, bludgeoned to death, her blood soaking through the mattress. Autopsy reports later revealed that she'd been brutally raped before being murdered. Investigators discovered a window that had been forced open and surmised that the killer may have gained entry and escaped through the same window. Following the direction of the killer's possible escape route, police discovered that it led to a turnpike that connected to a main road out of the area. Soon after police arrived, crime scene investigators began collecting evidence before Evelyn's body was taken to the mortuary. Her husband John did not receive a call from police after they discovered Evelyn's body. What he recalls was finding police tape stuck across the door and a few police officers canvassing the area. In a daze, he entered the house and discovered the furniture and cushions were out of place. He continued to the bedroom he shared with Evelyn and found half their king-size bed had been soaked through with blood. John would be the first to be questioned. It was normal police procedure to question the spouse in a situation like this, and he was the closest thing she'd had to family, as hers were over 4,000 miles away in Chilliwack. John explained the night's events to investigators leading up to the moment he arrived home to find it had become a crime scene. After he provided an alibi, he was allowed to go home. John continued to be cooperative with police, as he too wanted justice for his wife's murder. Police continued their investigation with the help of John and their friends. They interviewed multiple people and came to the conclusion that neither Evelyn nor John had any enemies that would want to harm either of them. In the meantime, police collected DNA from the crime scene and bagged evidence that they hoped could one day be used to find the killer. Although DNA testing was still in its infancy in the early 1980s, The technology was advancing rapidly. Detectives knew there was a possibility that something could be used at a later date to help pinpoint the culprit. Until then, though, it was going to be a waiting game. With no suspects, a cloud of suspicion loomed over John. When he'd taken Evelyn's body back home to Sardis, many people blamed him for her death, some even going as far as accusing him of her murder. The guilt he'd already been experiencing was compounded by the accusations. Evelyn's funeral service took place at St. Mary's Catholic Church in her hometown on February 1980. She was laid to rest at the Shackleton Reserve Cemetery. 3 months passed before any new information surfaced. Then in 1980, Miramar Police Department received a call regarding a similar crime that occurred in neighboring Volusia County. An arrest warrant had been issued for rape and attempted murder, and the circumstances were eerily similar to that of Evelyn's case. When police dug a bit deeper into the suspect's background, they were shocked to discover that he'd been living just 12 houses away from Evelyn and John. Ronald Eugene Richards had also been a resident at Haven Lake Estates and lived just down the line of houses from Evelyn. Richards did not know or interact with the couple while he'd stayed in the mobile home park, but he was no stranger to the law. In 1980, he was also 32 years old and throughout his adult life had been in and out of police custody for several crimes. During the time he was living at the estate, Richards was on parole for a voluntary manslaughter charge from 1975 that occurred in Ohio involving a former girlfriend. The similarities between the crimes in Volusia and Miramar were undeniable, but it was only circumstantial. And without physical evidence, they could not bring any charges against Richards. Although police were sure that Richards was responsible for the murder of Evelyn, they needed solid evidence that could link him to the crime. Frustrations grew as the years went by, and investigators would often look back at the case file searching for something new that could pin Richards to the murder and give the family the answers they needed. Years would turn into decades, and soon Evelyn's case, although not forgotten, would turn into Broward County's oldest unsolved case. It soon became clear that Evelyn was not the only victim of the crime. John too spiraled out of control, consumed by drugs and alcohol. The guilt of Evelyn's death was a constant reminder of his failure to protect her, as he'd sworn to do in his wedding vows. In interviews with reporters, he said that Evelyn's murder changed his character. From that moment to today, I've been a different person altogether because it changed the way I look at life. It changed how I feel about other people because I was very trusting before. Now I'm not, he said. After some time, though, he realized he could no longer drown his guilt in alcohol and drugs and made a drastic change. John eventually cleaned himself up and moved to England permanently. However, he never forgot Evelyn. Evelyn's family too would suffer. Both her parents, Charles and Ethel, would pass away without knowing the true identity of their daughter's murderer. In February 2012, her brother Leonard died as well. They were all buried at the Checkton Reserve Cemetery near Evelyn. Over the years, advancements in DNA research led to the closure of many cold cases. Detectives who had been working on Evelyn's case periodically retested the evidence they collected in hopes of finding new evidence in her case. When Miramar Police Detective Jonathan Zeller took over the case, he too wanted to solve the mystery that surrounded Evelyn's brutal slaying. He had been a little boy during the height of the investigation, and growing up in Miramar, he always knew the details of the case. Although he had other cases to solve, he was especially drawn to Evelyn's case. When he could, he followed up on every lead. In 2022, they finally had a breakthrough. Newer technology allowed the old DNA samples to be retested, and investigators could now confirm that Ronald Eugene Richards was, indeed, responsible for the murder of Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth. It wasn't hard to find Richards. In 1981, he was charged and found guilty of the rape and attempted murder that occurred in Volusia County in March 1980 and sentenced to 50 years in prison according to the Florida Department of Corrections. However, he was being held on charges for a parole violation in Ohio related to his initial crime in 1975. On November 30, 2022, a grand jury indicted Richards, now age 75, on the charges of sexual battery and murder for allegedly killing Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth. He now awaited extradition to Broward County to face charges for Evelyn's murder. Police believe that Richards might possibly be a serial killer and are investigating other cases he may be connected to. Miramar Police Division spokesperson, Tanya Ruse, said they were now one step closer to obtaining justice for Evelyn. As a result of developments in DNA know-how and the diligence and arduous work of Detective Jonathan Zeller, Ronald Eugene Richards has been indicted for sexual battery and homicide. Ruse added that Evelyn's case is now the oldest case solved in Miramar's history. Speaking at the press conference, Detective Zeller said it had been a whodunit case from the beginning. Finding Evelyn's killer was not only rewarding for him, but for all involved. It was a good feeling, he said, being able to solve the decades-old murder. Both Ruse and Zeller commended John Bamforth on his cooperation throughout the investigation and his search for justice. Bamforth told us he wanted justice. His life was never the same after that, said Zeller. Evelyn's cousin, Stephen Point, said her death devastated the Choctaw First Nation, and it was a relief to know someone had been charged. To have this news all these years later, my thought that it's too bad Uncle Charlie and Aunt Ethel weren't alive to get this news, he said. Following the news, the family released a statement to Global News stating that she is now peacefully resting with her parents Charles and Ethel and her brother Leonard. Our family hopes all murdered Indigenous women's families receive justice someday and that they don't have to wait for decades for closure or for the case to go cold to be solved. Our Auntie Evelyn was a beautiful, bright, fun, loving, and caring daughter, sister, aunt, and friend. Following the announcement of Richard's indictment, John Bamforth finally spoke out after 43 years. In a video call, he said that all he wanted was justice for Evelyn. I had a lot of guilt at the time because I wasn't home when I should have been, he said. He went on to describe Evelyn as the calmest person he ever met. Everybody loved her. She was just great to be around. I never had any regrets about being with her. It gave him a sense of relief knowing Richards had finally been charged. I'm not a vindictive person, but I certainly want to see justice for Evelyn, he said. For John, however, there will never be closure. I don't believe in this closure thing. One never has closure as far as you can tell. But certainly, justice for Evelyn is the most important thing. Ronald Richards' actions were undeniably selfish and senseless. Not only did he end the life of a woman who had everything to live for and could have possibly made a difference in many lives, he also tore apart several families through his evil deeds. Since the 1980s, Richards has spent the majority of his life behind bars, and with the new indictment, he will surely never taste freedom again. Christine McWhorter was born in Philadelphia in 1987. She disliked Philadelphia when she was a teenager due to the criminal activity that pervaded the city. She relocated to Huntington County in February 2008 to pursue her further education and in order to get away from the violence and crime in Philadelphia. She moved in with her Aunt Beatrice Daniels. Her aunt worked in the neighborhood and lived by herself at the time. Christine was residing comfortably in Huntington County and enrolled in a college where she studied business. Christine was also a mother of 2 children. She had a 4-month-old baby who was born in February 2008 and a 4-year-old son who was born in February 2004. Christine had a bright future in mind for her and her children. But for her and her aunt, things were about to take a sharp turn. In January 2009, Christine McWhorter, who was 22 at the time, along with her 2 children and her 31-year-old Aunt Beatrice Daniels, were living in the Chestnut Terrace apartment building in Huntington County, Pennsylvania. On the night of January 2nd, both of the women were lying in bed with the children in between them. All 4 of them were in a deep sleep, and as they slept, both Christine and Beatrice were shot in the head with a .25 caliber gun. Fortunately, Christine kids were unharmed during the incident, and it was Christine's 4-year-old son who went outside to call for aid. When the neighbors found out what had happened at Beatrice's place, they were in shock and could not believe what they'd just seen. They called the Huntington County Police Department and reported what they'd just seen. When the police came, they immediately began a thorough examination. The officers sealed off the residence and started interviewing the neighbors, but they received no interesting information in return. Inside the residence, they discovered blood on the doors and stairs which they took samples of. The case took a turn when the forensics team discovered the DNA of the 2 ladies as well as an unidentified male. The investigation was ongoing, but since there were no new leads after a while, the case gradually turned cold. In February 2016, after years of no development in the case, the DNA was transferred to Parabon Nanolabs, who used it to produce a possible depiction of the murderer's appearance. In accordance with this description, the murderer was thought to be a male with light to medium skin tone, green or brown eyes, and an African American. In February 2018, genetic genealogy was carried out using the DNA found at the crime, and a man named Maurico Johnson was identified as a possible suspect. He also matched the physical details Parabon had provided. When the police were given his name, they learned that Christine knew Cynthia Swan, Maurico's ex-girlfriend. Maurico admitted to knowing Christine and Beatrice through his girlfriend, Cynthia, when he was questioned by police in his house in February 2019. Yet he vehemently denied having any knowledge of their killings or even entering their residence. Maurico did provide police with a DNA sample which was forwarded to the state lab in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania by late 2019. Investigators obtained information from Maurico's time cards from the New York Department of Corrections, his previous job, while they awaited the results. He wasn't at work when the murders took place according to his time cards. In addition, his workplace was roughly 5 hours away from Christina and Beatrice's apartment. He didn't work on January 2, 2009, and his shift on January 3 didn't start until 7 in the morning. When the lab reported the results in January 2020, it was said that the DNA sample provided by Maurico matched the DNA from the blood discovered at the crime scene. Carroll Johnson Jr., Maurico's half-brother, was questioned by police after that. He told them that their deceased father possessed a .25 caliber rifle, the same kind that had killed the ladies, and that Maurico had received it in 1998 following his death. They also spoke with Maurico's former girlfriend, Cynthia Swan. Christine's phone received a text from Cynthia only moments before she passed away. Christine was instructed to call her, but she never did. She told authorities that she and Christine had planned to depart on January 1, 2009 for a weekend getaway, but had opted to stay home instead so that Cynthia could spend time with a man called Benjamin June. Cynthia claimed that Maurico had learned she was having an affair with Benjamin by this point. The father of Christine's oldest child, Robert Sheen Spade, was questioned by the police as well. On the night of the killings, Robert claimed to have visited Christine, Beatrice, and the children. He claimed that the women kept the flat immaculate and that the night he was there, he saw no signs of blood. Maurico was finally apprehended and accused of killing Beatrice and Christine in May 2022 after DNA evidence conclusively linked him to the blood at the crime scene. The case is still under hearing in Huntington County Court. His final statement is yet to be made. 36-year-old Jasmine Porter had a lot in her life to look forward to. In February 1996, Jasmine was 6 months pregnant with her second child, having already given birth to a son 5 years earlier. Pregnancy and motherhood weren't things that Jasmine had always dreamed of. According to her mother, she was the type of girl who liked to go out and have fun. Jasmine lived life to the fullest, and there wasn't a day when she wasn't smiling. When she was discovered she was pregnant with her firstborn, her attitude changed and she became a wonderful, nurturing mother. This announcement of her second pregnancy shocked her family, but Jasmine was excited to welcome a new bundle of joy into the world. As if Jasmine's life wasn't already busy enough, she'd returned to school to obtain qualifications to become an administrator. Jasmine juggled motherhood and school with ease thanks to the support of her family. Jasmine and her son resided in an apartment on Davidson Avenue in Morris Heights, New York, but Jasmine had been born and raised in Long Island. Shortly before her murder, Jasmine had prepared her Section 8 housing request to make the move from Morris Heights back to Long Island. Everything was slowly falling into place. The paperwork was due back any day, but tragedy would strike before Jasmine could ever return home. Neighbors in the apartment block where Jasmine and her son lived noticed their absence in early February. The residents would greet Jasmine and her son every morning as they made their way to school, but the pair were missing for some reason. The school confirmed with investigators and the family that Jasmine's son had failed to show up on February 5, 1996. This was very out of character, and Jasmine was considered to be a reliable parent. Neighbors were concerned by the lack of activity in Jasmine's apartment and decided to call the police. What the police found would shock and horrify them to the core. The New York Police Department and the New York Fire Department arrived at the apartments lining Davidson Avenue. According to neighbors, the police were led into the apartment by the fire service, who had to break down the front door. When the NYPD finally gained access to Jasmine's apartment, they were confronted with silence. Faint weeping could be heard emanating around the empty apartment. As they went further in, they saw Jasmine and her son. Incredibly, Jasmine's 5-year-old son was unharmed, but Jasmine was gone. According to Jasmine's family, he tried to clean the blood from her nose and had locked himself in the apartment. Jasmine's son was gently peeled away from his mother's side, where he'd sat for 2 to 3 days. When interviewed, he told the NYPD that he saw a man sitting on top of his mom and that he tried to help her, but the man was too strong and shouted at him to go away. Investigators found it challenging to interview Jasmine's son due to his age and the trauma he had experienced. Jasmine's body was removed from her apartment and transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. In their report, the medical examiner noted that Jasmine had bruises to her neck along with neck trauma. It was determined that she'd been strangled before being left in her apartment. It's believed that Jasmine's son witnessed the entire event, and investigators were unsure as to why the killer left him behind. Jasmine Porter's case was officially ruled as a homicide, and investigators were on the hunt to find her killer. The NYPD began combing through Jasmine's personal life, looking for any potential suspects. The father of her first son had never been named, and it's assumed that the police quickly ruled him out. Neighbors in the apartment complex where Jasmine lived did not recall hearing anything out of the ordinary or seeing anyone they didn't recognize over the weekend of February 3, 1996. When investigators had interviewed every family member and every friend, they began making public appeals for information. Jasmine's family also made public appeals begging for information. An inmate at a local prison contacted the NYPD claiming to have information about Jasmine's case. But this lead turned out to be yet another dead end. Jasmine's family hoped that one day the monster who deprived her and her son of a happy life would finally be brought to justice. 26 long years would pass by, and Jasmine's son would go on to grow up without his mother. Jasmine's family grieved knowing that Jasmine would never get to see her son graduate, marry, or pass his driving test. The pursuit of justice was at the forefront of the Porters' minds, and they ensured that the world would not forget her name. Hope came in early 2021 when the New York Police Department's Cold Case Squad decided to reopen the case. Investigators hoped that a fresh pair of eyes would bring about new clues and leads, and it did. Not only did investigators re-examine the initial interviews and interrogations performed, but a crucial piece of DNA evidence was also discovered. In 1996, the medical examiner had prepared fingernail scrapings from Jasmine and stored them for later use. For unknown reasons, these samples had not been tested earlier. Detective Robert Klein told the New York Post, "I knew that there was a high probability that there would be the suspect's DNA under those nails. The first step was to obviously find the evidence, which can sometimes be tricky. But in my efforts to reach out to the medical examiner and the people over there, they actually were able to find it. Took a while, but they found it. Using cutting-edge technology, forensic scientists with the New York Police Department were able to upload this DNA profile to Cody's. Now all they had to do was wait. According to reports, the evidence retrieval and testing took almost a year. After a long, arduous wait, Detective Klein and his team received a call that they'd been waiting for. The DNA found underneath Jasmine's fingernails belonged to 66-year-old Gregory Fleetwood. Detective Klein immediately began searching for Gregory's name in their database and found a lengthy criminal record. In 1984, Gregory stood accused of choking her. According to reports, the case didn't go to trial as the victim's family pressured her not to appear in court. In 1987, Gregory found himself on the wrong side of the law yet again when he became the prime suspect in another strangulation case. In this instance, Gregory had been accused of strangling his pregnant female friend in the Bronx. 52-year-old Andrea Ciancana was known to be a sweet and gentle woman in her community of Arlington, Virginia. Andrea worked at the Arlington Library and often put a smile on the face of her coworkers. By 1998, Andrea's son, Kevin Ciancana, was an adult himself, and she was excited to watch him flourish. Andrea too was flourishing, and she and her fiancé, James Christopher Johnson, had just celebrated 7 years together. The two were putting in the groundwork to build their dream home, but tragedy would strike the couple before this plan came to fruition. August 21st, 1998, started like any other day for Andrea and James. Andrea had planned to meet a friend for dinner before returning to her home to watch a film with James. James wasn't initially too concerned when 6 p.m. arrived and Andrea still hadn't returned home. That evening, he went to bed hoping to wake up beside his fiancée in the morning. But at 1:30 a.m., he awoke with a strange feeling in his stomach. He glanced at the closet door that was somehow open and began to advance towards it. When he opened the closet, he discovered the body of his fiancée, Andrea. The Arlington County Police Department, ACPD, were immediately summoned to the apartment in the 1700 block of North Road Street, which was declared a crime scene. Bizarrely, investigators found no traces of blood or injury to Andrea, and the coroner would later determine that Andrea's cause of death was a homicide. Investigators began searching the apartment for clues but failed to detect any sign of a struggle or forced entry. James, Andrea's fiancé, was the first person the ACPD wanted to talk to, and he cracked under pressure. What followed would be one of the most bizarre police interrogations ever. After 3 days, James made a half-confession stating, "It's all very hazy, just an image. I see me holding her and she slips out of my hands and she goes down to the floor. I fell on top of her. She hit her head on the desk." Some of the investigators present jumped with glee. They had just elicited a confession and the case was closed, right? Other officers quickly pointed out one fatal flaw in James' confession. Andrea had died as a result of strangulation, not blunt force trauma. In fact, there were little to no injuries or bruises on her head or body to indicate blunt force trauma. James remained terrified that he was about to go down for killing his fiancée. To his surprise, officers entered the room and told him that he was free to go without charge. The officers knew James' confession was false due to a statement, and he had also been unable to describe the crime scene to investigators accurately. No matter how many of them believed that he was responsible, the ACPD had no option but to let James go. They were probably freeing a killer, and the community was outraged. In the aftermath of James' interrogation, people in Arlington were frightened. In their eyes, James had killed his fiancée and had gotten away with it. Kevin Chincata, Andrea's son, was determined not to let James get away with his crimes, and he began his own investigation. Shortly after James had been released, Kevin contacted the ACPD with a vital new clue. Just weeks before Andrea's death, a man named Bobby Joe Leonard had shown up at the apartment. Andrea later told Kevin and James that Bobby had been at the apartment to remove her old PC. Andrea stated that the two were alone in the apartment whilst Bobby removed the PC and several other items, but the transaction went without incident. Kevin pleaded with investigators to take a closer look at Bobby, and when they did, they discovered something disturbing. Bobby Joe Leonard was no ordinary man. Just weeks before Andrea's murder, he'd been released from prison on assault and sodomy charges. This new information gave investigators a nod in their stomachs. Bobby was brought in for questioning, but he maintained his innocence. Without concrete evidence or a confession, the APDC could not charge and arrest Bobby, and he too was a free man. In 1999, the Arlington Police Department received a shocking call. A woman had been found clinging to life in a closet in Fairfax County, Virginia. Like Andrea, she'd been strangled, assaulted, and stuffed into a closet. Amazingly, the woman survived her attack and named Bobby Joe Leonard as her attacker. In February, Bobby was put before the courts, which found him guilty of the offense. For his sick crime, he was ordered to serve a life sentence. Investigators noticed that the 1999 crime had striking similarities to Andrea's case just 1 year prior. Bobby maintained his innocence whenever the ACPD interviewed him, and the case quickly ran cold. Kevin, Andrea's son, never gave up hope that one day his mother's case would be solved. And in February 2018, his prayers would be answered by Detective Rosa Ortiz. The cold case unit initially reopened the case in February 2013, which took another look at the files and evidence. In 2018, Detective Ortiz decided to visit Bobby in prison to see if he had any new information. When Detective Ortiz stepped into the interview room, she expected to be stonewalled by the convict. But as Bobby parted his lips to speak, something strange happened. For years, Bobby had staunchly denied any involvement in Andrea's murder. But that day in February 2018 was different. Bobby openly admitted to killing Andrea Sincata in 1998. But there was a twist. Bobby hadn't just picked out Andrea randomly. This was a case of a hit for hire. Bobby told Detective Ortiz that he'd received a phone call from a man that sounded like Andrea's fiancé, James Christopher Johnson. The man offered Bobby $5,000 to kill Andrea, and Bobby accepted the hit. And a few days later, he arrived at Andrea's apartment and attacked her. Bobby also told Detective Ortiz that he'd never received payment for the hit as promised. As a result of this new confession, Bobby Joe Leonard and James Christopher Johnson were arrested and charged with murder. In a shocking turn of events, James was found not guilty by a jury that took just an hour to decide. According to the Washington Post, the judge presiding over the case questioned why James had been arrested in the first place. While James had gotten away scot-free once again, Bobby was not so lucky. When asked why he made the shocking confession in February 2018, Bobby replied that a voice inside of him compelled him to tell the truth. He felt that he needed to admit that he'd hurt someone and repent for his sins. Bobby was apologetic during his confession, saying sorry to the friends and family of Andrea. Bobby Joe Leonard was found guilty of the murder of Andrea Sincata and was given another life sentence that will run consecutively. During the trial, Kevin issued a victim impact statement. "The crime didn't just alter my life, it destroyed it. I lost relationships. I lost my emotional support system. I lost my entire family. I lost my life as I knew it. I didn't want to go on living, but one thing kept me going. I wanted to know what happened to my mom so that I could grieve. You can't grieve about what happened if you don't know what happened." Brenda Venables was born in 1932 to her parents Harold and Winifred in the tiny village of Rauschach in Worcester in the United Kingdom. She was the oldest of 3 children and had 2 sisters, Jane and Rita. The family ran a farm and the girls helped out with work wherever necessary. They lived a happy life, and Brenda grew up as a friendly, carefree girl beloved by all who knew her. When Brenda was 23, she was attending a young farmers event in 1955 where she met David Venables, another young farmer who she immediately became smitten with. David lived in Kempsey, another small village not too far from Rauschach where Brenda was from. For a few years, on the way to and from the Birmingham wholesale market where David would go to deliver products from his farm, he'd stop at Brenda's home on the way back and spend time with her. They fell deeper and deeper in love, and on June 1, 1960, they got married in a small intimate ceremony with their family and friends. After a wonderful honeymoon in Jersey, they moved to David's newly constructed Quaking House farm in February 1961. The property had stunning views of the Malvern Hills in a rural area south of Kempsey. For the next few years, Brenda and David seemed like they had a perfect life, living together in peace and harmony. A devoted wife, Brenda helped deliver flowers from the farm's nursery, but most of her time was spent taking care of David. She was well liked and praised by all the farm workers and was regarded as very prim and proper. However, as the years rolled on, she began to grow unhappy in her marriage. Brenda was unable to conceive children, and David cared less and less for her and spent most of his time out of the house. Reserved Brenda chose not to express the loneliness she was feeling in her loveless marriage. Her medical history from that time shows that she was suffering from depression. In 1982, Brenda developed suicidal tendencies as a result of thinking her position was beyond hope. However, she told her doctors she was feeling better a few weeks later. She was unable to go to the hospital since David objected to her going to the clinic. Brenda tumbled down the stairs at the May 1982 while suffering from the flu, injuring her leg, which was then bandaged from the ankle to the knee. She could not walk very far and had poor ankles. She also had arthritis. On the morning of May 1982, David woke up and Brenda was not in bed next to him. He searched the house and the farm grounds but could not find her, so he had to report her missing. At the time, Missing persons investigations weren't anywhere as meticulous as they are today. There was an extensive search of the farm and the surrounding areas. West Mercia police used a helicopter to aid with the search, and tracker dogs checked farm buildings and derelict properties, but no trace of her was found. The search lasted for 5 weeks and covered a 4 or 5 mile area around Kempsey up to the M50 motorway. Many people believed that due to her depression, Mary may have taken her own life. Eventually, the police had no more trails to follow, so the search was called off and the case went cold. For the next 4 decades, her family was left wondering what could have happened to Brenda. By July 2019, new owners had purchased Quaking House Farm from David, who'd sold it and moved elsewhere. The new owners wanted to clean a septic tank on the property that had become blocked. When the workers began cleaning, they were horrified to find the remains of a body. The engineer Alistair Pitt pulled out a clump of hair before uncovering a human skull. A pelvis and thigh bones were also recovered, along with remnants of clothing, including half a pair of underwear, a pair of tights, a bra, the remains of some shoes, and a sweater. At the time of the discovery, a search was ongoing just 7 miles away for state agent Susie Lampla, who disappeared in London. The remains were thought to be hers. It took over a year for detectives to confirm that the bones belonged to Brenda. When this was confirmed, her husband David, now 88, immediately became a suspect in her murder. He was charged by police in 2019 and the case went to trial. At the trial, a number of details about David's double life came to light. During his marriage to Brenda, he had had a long-term on and off affair with Lorraine Stiles, his mother's nurse, which started in 1967 according to the prosecution. Even though Mrs. Stiles passed away in 2017, the court heard a statement she made to police in 1984 shortly after Brenda had vanished. She claimed that he called her the day after he reported his wife missing to the police. He seemed quite composed and suddenly told me his wife had disappeared the night before, and he was phoning to let me know before I read it in the newspaper, her statement said. The prosecutors cited his long-term affair and him knowing about the secluded septic tank as the perfect hiding place as proof behind his involvement in the murder. They also shot down claims from the defense that Brenda could have committed suicide by entering the tank by proving it was impossible for her to have shut the heavy concrete lid on herself after entering. In the end, in July 2022, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Brenda. He'll now spend the rest of his life in jail like he deserves. Sadly, Brenda's parents and sisters did not live to see her killer being caught. Her surviving nieces were relieved that her murderer had been brought to justice, but were also furious that the man who was supposed to care for and protect Brenda was the one who took her life. In a statement they provided, they said, "We, Brenda's nieces and nephews, are relieved that today, after a wait of 40 years, at last there is justice for Brenda. David Venables can no longer get away with having murdered his wife, the hiding of her body, and all his deceit, lies, and fabrications." Xu Ming Tang was born on February 1940 in Taiwan. Tang, who was a beloved husband and father, was known as a family man. He served time as an officer in the Taiwanese Air Force. After his retirement from the force, he decided to move his family to America in hopes of living out the American dream. Eventually, he immigrated to the city of San Carlos in San Mateo County, California, along with his wife, young son, and daughter. He was happy to be getting away from Tiananmen Square protests and growing tensions between China and Taiwan. Tang wanted to provide a better education and safer life for his family in the United States. Little did he realize that his dream would one day become a nightmare. As the family settled down in the small town of San Carlos, with his hardworking nature and a keen interest in business, Tang opened up a small mom and pop shop called the Devonshire Little Store. This was located on a corner of Devonshire Boulevard in San Mateo County. Even though his English was not very good, his friendly and welcoming nature made him a beloved fixture in the community. On the morning of April 26, 1993, following his regular routine, 53-year-old Xu Mingtang opened his store. Unfortunately, this would be the last time he ever did so. Just before 1 p.m. on the same day, officers with the San Carlos Police Department responded to a 911 call about a possible shooting at the family-owned Devonshire Little Store. Upon arriving at the scene only minutes later, officers found the store owner, Tang, lying unresponsive in a pool of blood on the floor. Tang had sustained a single gunshot wound to the chest. Paramedics rushed him to a nearby hospital, but he succumbed to his injuries soon after arriving at the facility. The crime made no sense. Tang had no known enemies, and there was no significant amount of money to be stolen. The senseless crime shocked the community to its core. Although police theorized that Tang fell victim to a robbery that went wrong, no evidence was found at the crime scene that could lead to the killer. Police only got a vague description of the shooter, a Caucasian woman in her mid-20s or early 30s with shoulder-length light brown hair driving a faded blue 1970s station wagon. Some physical evidence was found at the store, but DNA technology at the time was not advanced enough to produce any further leads. Over the few months after the jarring murder, the description of the suspect was circulated in newspapers and news broadcasts in hopes of solving the crime. Despite following up on hundreds of tips, none of them panned out. Heartbroken and left with the question of who was responsible for Tang's heinous murder, his wife sold the store to another Taiwanese family in July of 1993, just 3 months after the murder. Unable to reside where her husband was brutally gunned down, she moved to Los Angeles sometime later. The store, despite the horrific tragedy, is still in operation even after all these years. The crime went on to gain national recognition and was featured on America's Most Wanted, but every effort remained fruitless and the case went cold. As San Carlos moved on with time, it remained a topic of discussion over the years within the community. But as years passed, people believed that there was very little chance of this case ever being solved. In 2010, the case was once again reviewed, but investigators ended up bringing nothing new to the table. For 29 years, the case file was sitting on the dust-filled shelves of the San Carlos Police Department and perhaps would have remained so if not for a remarkable discovery made out of sheer luck. On Wednesday, March 16, 2022, detectives from Sacramento and Oklahoma conducted simultaneous operations in 2 locations for an unrelated crime. Nobody expected at the time that these operations would turn up additional evidence in this cold case. During the investigation, Oklahoma authorities stumbled upon a diary in a home in the rural town of Dewey, north of Tulsa. During their search of the home, they found a private journal titled "Things I Regret." In it was an account of the slaying of a Korean man during a store robbery in San Carlos in 1993. As police traced back the owner of the diary, they identified a 61-year-old woman named Reina Hoffman Ramos. While Tang was Taiwanese, not Korean, the journal entry matched the other details of the case. Reina perfectly matched the description of the woman who was seen fleeing the scene at the time. Detectives later confirmed that at the time of Tang's murder, Reina was living in a home in nearby San Mateo. On March 16, 2022, Reina was arrested from her home in Dewey, Oklahoma. Records show that she'd been arrested repeatedly in that area for drug-related and other non-violent offenses in the years after Tang's murder. Authorities later recovered a few unspecified pieces of new evidence in the searches conducted in her house. Reina Hoffman Ramos remains in custody in Washington County Jail in Oklahoma, pending extradition to California. She's charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of second-degree robbery, and 8 criminal enhancements based largely on the content of her private journal confession about regrets. On Wednesday, April 29, 2009, the Dodge County Sheriff's Office responded to Lone Road, less than 1 mile from State Highway 175 in the town of Teresa, Wisconsin, regarding a gruesome discovery. A man found a white plastic garbage bag on his property in the woods. Inside the bag, he got a quick glance of a bloody towel and a possible fetus or newborn baby. Horrified, he immediately dialed 911. Upon arriving, the remains were confirmed to be the body of a newborn baby girl. Investigators scoured the area in search of evidence. Unfortunately, nothing of significance was found. A DNA sample, however, was recovered from a maxi pad wrapping which was found inside the trash bag. No additional piece of clothing, jewelry, or personal items were found at the scene. At this point, all they could do was wait for the autopsy results to gather information on the deceased child. On April 30, 2009, The autopsy was performed at the office of the Dodge County Medical Examiner. The autopsy suggested that the baby was a full-term infant weighing 8 pounds and 20.5 inches in length. Except for her hair color being black, there were no distinguishable marks on the baby's body. She was estimated to be less than a week old. However, the autopsy findings also indicated something unexpected. Contrary to the investigators' initial assumption, the results showed that the baby had suffered no trauma which would have resulted in her death. Hence, her death was not a homicide. In addition to that, a complete toxicology screen was performed and came back as negative for any drugs in her system. Tests were conducted to determine the cause of death for the baby. Based on those tests, the pathologist concluded that the incident was a fetal demise, indicating that the child might have died either prior to or during birth. The only clue investigators had was a vague description of a potential suspect who could have been responsible for disposing of the baby. While talking to the locals, police learned that a suspicious metallic blue Dodge Shadow, possibly a 1993 model, with a black hood was seen in the area prior to the baby's discovery. A composite sketch of the driver was produced, but whether the driver was male or female could not be verified. Detectives also distributed the composite pictures of the baby, but no plausible lead was ever generated from that. No one came forward to claim the child as their own. Although the remains were at a recognizable state, authorities at the time worked tirelessly to identify family members of baby Teresa. Unfortunately, no relatives could be located and the baby remained unclaimed. In an act of compassion, investigators attempted to give some dignity and identity to the little girl by naming her baby Teresa after the village where she was found. Despite being unable to identify any family members, detectives wanted to provide her with a proper burial. On Monday, May 2009, baby Teresa was finally laid to rest at the Lowell Cemetery in southwest Dodge County, Wisconsin. Her family might not have been present at her burial, but the community in Dodge County stepped up to pay their respects and gathered at her final resting place to bid her farewell. While the case went cold due to a lack of evidence, over the years detectives dedicated their time to continue investigating and attempting to use advances in forensic science in their search for a suspect. Back in February 2014, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison analyzed evidence recovered from the scene and developed what's believed to be a DNA profile of the biological mother. The DNA profile was run through a national database of convicted felons and sex offenders to look for a match, but none was found. While the charges of homicide could not be imposed in this case, a Jane Doe warrant for the crime of hiding a corpse was issued. The warrant alleviated any statute of limitations requirements. The identity of the suspect, however, remained a mystery. It would take 13 years of diligent effort from the investigators working on the case to unravel the secrets that led to the disposal of baby Teresa. In a March 2018 press conference, the detectives from the Dodge County Sheriff's Office revealed the identity of the biological mother of baby Teresa, whom they'd arrested that same month on the charge of concealing her child's death and disposing of her body. The mother was identified as a 45-year-old Milwaukee woman, Karen Luttinen. The criminal complaint lodged against Karen revealed details of how investigators tracked Karen down after years of searching, starting with the DNA recovered at the scene. Investigators were able to gather genetic evidence from the newborn as well as the garbage bag and its other contents. With each passing year, the DNA advancements were enhanced, which ultimately offered a real chance of this case being solved. Some of the DNA that was uploaded to public DNA databases hit a match to a close female relative of the child's biological mother. After establishing that link, investigators kept digging. According to the complaint, further investigation on the family tree identified someone with the last name of Luttinen as a potential match. Family Tree is a DNA testing agency that offers genetic testing to determine relationships between individuals or to learn more about a person's ancestry. The complaint does not indicate when officers learned of the possible connection, but they eventually tracked down Karen at some point. Investigators first made contact with Karen along with her longtime boyfriend, whose name was never publicly released, in January of 2021. At the time, they both agreed to submit DNA swabs. Further analysis on those DNA samples showed that it matched the DNA evidence found at the crime scene. The pair were almost certainly the biological parents of baby Teresa. In a phone call, Authorities informed Karen's boyfriend that he was the likely father, to which he expressed surprise. He had no knowledge of her ever being pregnant. After that, as the complaint continues, the call was placed on speakerphone and Karen was told that she was the mother, to which she neither admitted nor denied anything. In further interviews, Karen and her boyfriend both claimed not to know she was pregnant. However, Karen later confessed that she thought she might be pregnant but was in complete denial. Despite feeling fetal movement, she kept trying to convince herself otherwise, fearing that her relationship would not last long. She claimed that she felt it more and more toward the end of the pregnancy. At that point, she was almost sure that she was carrying a child inside of her. Even then, she did not seek help from anyone, as her mind could not grasp the fact that she was indeed about to give birth. It was most likely April 28, 2009 when Karen said that her water broke while sitting on a toilet. She gave birth to baby Teresa all alone in a bathtub partially filled with water. Karen claimed she passed out for about 15 minutes from the exhaustion of the childbirth and woke up to find the baby was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. When the baby did not move or cry, Karen assumed her child was already dead. The complaint states that in a state of panic, Karen put the baby in a towel and then drove aimlessly. At one point during the drive, she abandoned the body at the wooded area where baby Teresa's remains were later recovered. She also claimed to have heard nothing about the discovery of the body in the news. In September of 2021, the Dodge County District Attorney's Office sentenced Karen Luttinen to 6 months in jail and 3 years of probation on a charge of concealing the death of a child. The court stayed a sentence of 1.5 years in prison and 2 years of probation, which will only be served if Karen does not successfully complete probation. As part of her probation, she was also ordered to pay a $5,000 fine, complete 60 hours of community service, and undergo mental health treatment.